Picture the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, an empire where the sun never set, where British flags flew over a quarter of the globe's landmass, where London's financial markets dictated terms to nations across 6 continents. For 3 centuries, Britain didn't just rule the waves, it owned them. From the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the tea gardens of India, from the gold mines of South Africa to the trading posts of Hong Kong, wealth flowed into London like tributaries feeding a mighty river. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. The richest empire in human history didn't fall to enemy armies or revolutionary wars, it bankrupted itself. And the weapon that destroyed it wasn't cannons or cavalry, it was debt. Every empire tells itself the same lie, that its power is permanent, that its wealth is infinite, that the rules of money don't apply to those who rule the world. Britain believed this lie longer and harder than any empire before it. And when reality came calling, the crash was so brutal that it changed the entire global order forever. What makes this story terrifying for Americans today isn't just that Britain fell. It's how familiar their mistakes sound when you look at modern Washington. The British Empire at its peak controlled roughly 400 million people. British merchants dominated global trade routes. British banks financed everything from railroads in Argentina to rubber plantations in Malaysia. The Royal Navy was so dominant that other nations needed British permission just to move goods across their own coastal waters. And at the heart of this machine sat London, the undisputed financial capital of the world. But running a global empire is expensive, brutally expensive. Every colony needed administrators. Every trade route required protection. Every rebellion demanded military response. The British learned what every imperial power discovers eventually. The bigger your empire grows, the more it costs to hold together. The first crack appeared during the Boer War. What should have been a quick campaign turned into a 3-year nightmare that drained the British treasury. Britain had to borrow heavily. The empire that had grown rich by lending money to other nations was suddenly begging for loans itself. This should have been a warning. Instead, it became a habit. Then came the Great War. And with it, financial catastrophe on a scale no empire had ever faced. The war lasted for years and cost Britain over £9 billion. Britain had to borrow almost all of it, and most dangerously, from the United States. American banks became Britain's financial lifeline. By 1918, Britain owed American creditors over $4 billion. The empire that had once been the world's banker was now the world's biggest debtor. But the borrowing didn't stop when the guns fell silent. Britain faced massive reconstruction costs, enormous pension obligations, and the political pressure to maintain living standards. Social spending exploded, financed with borrowed money. Meanwhile, Britain's ability to earn money was collapsing. The war had shattered trade patterns, rivals had built their own industries, and Britain's former customers had learned to live without British goods. Revenue was falling just as expenses were skyrocketing. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1914, Britain's national debt stood at around £700 million. By 1920, it had exploded to over £7 billion, a tenfold increase in just 6 years. Interest payments alone were consuming nearly half of all government revenue. Britain was trapped in the same vicious cycle that has destroyed countless nations throughout history, borrowing money to pay the interest on money they had already borrowed. Currency markets began to notice. The pound sterling, which had been as reliable as sunrise for over 2 centuries, started to wobble. International investors began asking uncomfortable questions. Could the empire actually pay its debts? Was the pound still worth what it claimed to be? For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's credit rating was in doubt. The government's response was predictable and disastrous. Instead of cutting spending or raising taxes enough to balance the books, they chose the path of least political resistance. They inflated their way out of trouble, or tried to. The Bank of England began printing money to buy government bonds, a policy that sounded sophisticated and harmless. Quantitative easing. But the effect was as old as economics itself. More money chasing the same goods meant higher prices for everyone. Inflation hit British families like a tax on existence. But inflation couldn't solve Britain's fundamental problem. The empire was spending far more than it earned, and no amount of monetary manipulation could change that arithmetic. The bills kept coming due, and the creditors kept demanding payment in real money, not inflated pounds. Britain found itself in the position of a family using credit cards to make minimum payments on other credit cards. The debt was growing faster than their ability to service it. International pressure began to mount. The United States, now Britain's largest creditor, started demanding changes to British economic policy. American officials made it clear that future loans would come with conditions. Britain would have to cut spending, raise taxes, and abandon the expensive pretense of global dominance. The empire that had dictated terms to the world for 3 centuries was now taking orders from foreign banks. The psychological impact was devastating. They had confused temporary dominance with permanent superiority, and debt was teaching them the difference. As the 1920s progressed, the cracks in Britain's financial foundation became impossible to hide. The empire that had once financed railroads across continents couldn't afford to maintain its own infrastructure. The navy that had ruled the seas for centuries was being scrapped to save money. The government that had guaranteed stability to half the world couldn't guarantee its own solvency. History was about to teach Britain the same lesson it had taught Rome, Spain, and every other empire that confused borrowing with earning. Debt is patient, but it is also relentless, and when it comes to collect, it doesn't care about your past glory or your future dreams. The breaking point came with brutal suddenness. On September 16, 1931, Britain faced what economists call a speculative attack. Foreign investors began dumping British pounds en masse. They had lost confidence in Britain's ability to maintain the gold standard. Within hours, the Bank of England was hemorrhaging gold reserves at a rate that would have emptied its vaults within days. Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer faced an impossible choice: defend the pound by raising interest rates to crushing levels, which would destroy the domestic economy, or abandon the gold standard and admit that British money was no longer backed by anything real. The decision was made. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound, once the most trusted currency on earth, became just another piece of paper backed only by government promises. The psychological shock reverberated around the world. If Britain, the financial bedrock of the global economy, couldn't maintain sound money, what did that say about everyone else? Within weeks, over 20 countries had followed Britain off the gold standard. The international monetary system that had provided stability for generations collapsed like dominoes. But abandoning gold didn't solve Britain's debt problem. It only changed the nature of the crisis. Now Britain could print pounds to pay its domestic debts, but its foreign creditors weren't interested in devalued British currency. They wanted payment in dollars or gold, and Britain had precious little of either. The empire found itself in the humiliating position of negotiating payment schedules with its former colonies, begging for time to meet obligations it had once guaranteed with imperial confidence. The human cost was staggering. By 1932, over 3 million Britons were unemployed. Industrial production had fallen by a third. The working class that had built the empire found themselves surplus to requirements. Social unrest followed economic collapse like night follows day. The empire itself began to fracture under financial pressure. Colonies that had once been profitable assets became expensive liabilities. India, the crown jewel of the empire, was demanding independence and refusing to shoulder Britain's debt burden. American creditors watched these developments with cold calculation. They had lent money to the British Empire, not to a declining power. Quietly, American officials began pressuring Britain to liquidate assets to pay down debt. British investments in American companies were sold at fire sale prices. Caribbean islands were transferred to American control. Military bases were handed over to settle accounts. Britain's naval dominance, the foundation of its global power for 3 centuries, was systematically dismantled by debt. Warships were scrapped, naval bases closed, and entire fleets decommissioned. The Royal Navy that had once been larger than the next 2 navies combined shrank to a coastal defense force. By the late 1930s, the transformation was complete, but not yet acknowledged. Britain still had the trappings of empire, the ceremonies, the titles, the maps colored red. But the financial reality was stark. London was no longer the center of global finance. New York had claimed that crown, and with it, the power to shape the world economy. Britain's collapse holds up a mirror to modern America, and the reflection should terrify every citizen who values financial stability. The parallels are undeniable. Massive military spending justified by global commitments, debt growing faster than the ability to service it, politicians choosing inflation over hard choices, foreign creditors quietly gaining leverage over domestic policy. The same arrogance that convinced British leaders their empire was too big to fail now echoes in Washington corridors. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with devastating precision. The empire that ruled the world for 3 centuries destroyed itself, not through war or revolution, but through the simple mathematics of spending more than it earned. America today carries debt levels that would have horrified British chancellors even at their most reckless. The question isn't whether financial gravity applies to superpowers. Britain proved it does. The question is whether Americans will learn from Britain's warning or repeat its mistakes.